The fire had been burning for 3 days before anyone thought to ask where the metal had come from. Not the fire itself. Fires were ordinary. What was not ordinary was what remained when it cooled. Something harder than copper, darker, heavier in the hand in a way that felt deliberate, as though the material understood its own purpose before the men who made it did. This was not yet the Bronze Age. That name would come later, much later, assigned by men who were already centuries removed from the moment it began. The people who lived through the beginning had no name for what they were entering. They rarely do. What they had was a problem. Copper was soft. It bent when it should hold. It dulled when it should cut. For generations, for more generations than any single mine could count, the craftsmen of the ancient world had worked within that limitation. They had built tools, weapons, ornaments. They had built entire economies around a metal that was, at its core, insufficient. The world before bronze was not primitive. That is the first misunderstanding. The assumption that what came before was lesser, simpler, waiting to be improved. The settlements of the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Age that preceded everything, had already developed agriculture complex enough to sustain cities. They had trade. They had hierarchy. They had religion, which is to say, they had questions they could not answer, and had decided to live with them anyway. What they did not have was a metal that could hold an edge. The transition happened slowly, then all at once, which is how most transitions happen when examined closely enough. Somewhere in the arc between 3500 and 3000 BCE, in workshops scattered across what is now Turkey, Iran, the Levant, craftsmen began to notice that copper smelted in the presence of other ores behaved differently. The resulting alloy was harder, more reliable. It held its shape under pressure. They did not understand why. The chemistry of it, the way tin atoms slot between copper atoms in a lattice that resists deformation, was not available to them as an explanation. What was available to them was the object itself, the weight of it, the edge that lasted. The earliest bronze objects we have found are not weapons. They are pins, figurines, small tools, the kind of objects that speak to a craftsman's curiosity more than a general's ambition. Someone experimenting, testing, holding a new thing up to the light and deciding, for reasons they could not articulate, that it was worth pursuing. There is something quietly unsettling about that image. A craftsman in a workshop that no longer exists, in a city that has no name in any surviving record, turning a small bronze pin in their fingers, not knowing, could not have known, that the object in their hand was the beginning of something that would reshape every civilization on Earth, and end most of them. The Chalcolithic world was not waiting to become the Bronze Age. It was simply existing, farming, trading, building, dying. The shift came from the edges, as shifts usually do, from the workshops of Anatolia, from the smelting sites of the Caucasus, from places where the ore was close to the surface and the knowledge of metallurgy had been accumulating quietly for generations. By 3000 BCE, bronze was spreading. Not quickly. Nothing spread quickly in a world where information traveled only as fast as a person could walk, but steadily. Carried by traders who understood its value before they understood its composition, exchanged for grain, for livestock, for the other metals needed to make it. Tin was the problem that no one had solved yet. Copper was abundant. It could be found across the ancient world, in Cyprus, in Anatolia, in the mountains of the Mycenae. But tin was different. Tin deposits were sparse, concentrated in specific regions that did not always overlap with the civilizations that needed the metal most. To make bronze, you needed both. which meant you needed a supply chain, which meant you needed, for the first time in human history, something that resembled international trade. The Bronze Age did not begin with a battle. It did not begin with a king or a decree or a discovery announced to a waiting crowd. It began in workshops, in trading posts, in the slow accumulation of knowledge passed between craftsmen who never met each other and never knew they were part of the same story. What they were building, without knowing they were building it, was a system, a network of exchange that would eventually span from Britain to Mesopotamia, from Scandinavia to Egypt, a network so tightly interconnected that when one part of it failed, the failure would travel faster than any messenger could run. But that was still centuries away. In 1300 BCE, the network was young. The cities were still learning what they were. The metal was still a curiosity in many places, a luxury in others, a weapon only beginning to be understood. The craftsmen, with the bronze pin, turned it in their fingers. And somewhere already, someone else was thinking about what else could be made. The trader arrived with no name for what he was carrying. He knew its weight. He knew what it could buy. He had carried it across 3 mountain passes and 2 river crossings, wrapped in cloth that had long since absorbed the smell of the metal itself, a faint, cold smell, like stone after rain. What he did not know, and would not have cared to know, was that the material in his pack was in the process of rewriting the world. The tin roots were the first great secret of the Bronze Age. Not secret by design. There was no conspiracy, no deliberate concealment. Secret simply because the knowledge of where tin could be found was rare, and rare knowledge, in any age, becomes power before anyone decides to make it so. The deposits were scattered. Afghanistan, Cornwall, the mountains of Anatolia, Sardinia, small pockets of cassiterite ore in places that required weeks of travel to reach from the centers of civilization, which meant that the civilizations that wanted bronze, and by 2800 BCE, every civilization that knew about bronze wanted it, had to build relationships with people they had never met, across distances they could not easily cross. This was new. Not trade itself. Trade was ancient, older than cities, older than writing. What was new was the scale, the dependency. The fact that a palace in Mesopotamia now required a steady supply of something that could only be found thousands of kilometers away, carried by people whose languages they did not speak, through territories they did not control. The system that emerged was not planned. It grew the way living things grow, opportunistically, filling available space, developing structure only after the fact. Merchants who had been trading copper began adding tin to their inventory. Middlemen appeared between the mines and the workshops. Cities that happened to sit along the routes became wealthy, not because of what they produced, but because of where they were. Kanesh was one of those cities, a trading colony established by Assyrian merchants in the heart of Anatolia around 1900 BCE, though the patterns it represented had been forming for centuries before anyone thought to write them down. The tablets found there, thousands of them, record transactions in a tone so matter-of-fact it is almost startling. Complaints about delayed shipments, arguments over quality, instructions sent across hundreds of kilometers with the confidence of men who believed the system would hold. They were right, for a time. What the tablets from Kanesh reveal, and what makes them quietly unsettling to read, is how modern the anxiety sounds. A merchant writes to his agent, "The tin you sent was not the agreed weight." Another writes, "The textiles arrived damaged. I cannot sell them at the price we discussed." A third, "I've been waiting for your reply for 2 months. What is happening there?" The Bronze Age traded in real things, metal, wool, grain, oil. But it ran on trust, on the assumption that the person at the other end of the route would honor the agreement, that the city in between would remain open, that the mountain pass would still be passable when the season turned. It was a system built on continuity, and continuity in the ancient world was never guaranteed. The workshops, meanwhile, were learning. Metallurgy in the early Bronze Age was partly knowledge and partly intuition. Craftsmen who understood, through generations of practice, that the ratio of tin to copper mattered, that the temperature of the smelting mattered, that the cooling mattered. 10% tin to 90% copper produced a metal with properties unlike anything that had existed before. Harder than copper, easier to cast, capable of holding a fine edge. The weapons that emerged from those workshops began to change warfare before anyone had developed a theory of warfare to accommodate them. Swords became possible, long blades that would have snapped instantly in copper. Helmets, greaves. The armored soldier was not an invention of genius. He was the inevitable product of a metal that could be shaped into almost anything a craftsman was patient enough to attempt. And patience, in those workshops, was not in short supply. These were men who had inherited a tradition, reaching back through their fathers and their fathers' fathers to the first tentative experiments with alloy, who understood their craft not as a profession, but as a lineage, who passed knowledge forward in the same way the traders passed tin, carefully, across distances, with the quiet confidence that someone at the other end would know what to do with it. By 2500 BCE, bronze was no longer a curiosity. It was infrastructure. The civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Aegean, each of them had built systems of production, distribution, and use around a metal that none of them could produce entirely on their own. They were bound together by their dependencies in ways they understood only partially, if at all. The trader reached his destination. He unwrapped the cloth. The merchant on the other side weighed the tin without speaking, recorded the transaction on a tablet that would be fired in a kiln and survive 4,000 years, and handed over the agreed payment. Neither of them knew what they had built. Neither of them knew what would happen when it broke. The first word ever written was not a prayer. It was a receipt. A small clay tablet, pressed with a reed stylus somewhere in southern Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, records the delivery of barley, the quantities, the name of the official who received it, the name of the institution that sent it. Nothing more, no poetry, no philosophy, no attempt to capture the texture of a life or the weight of a belief, just numbers and the names of things that could be counted. Writing was invented to manage surplus. That is the fact that tends to disappoint people when they first encounter it. The assumption that language, when finally committed to a permanent surface, would reach immediately for the transcendent. Instead, it reached for the granary, for the storehouse, for the administrative problem of tracking resources across a system too large for any single memory to hold. Sumer had that problem. By 3000 BCE, the cities of southern Mesopotamia, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, had grown to a scale that no previous human settlement had attempted. Uruk alone may have housed 50,000 people at its peak. 50,000 people require food, water, housing, labor coordination, dispute resolution, and the management of the dead. They require, in other words, a state. And a state at that scale requires records. The scribes who developed cuneiform, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay that would become the dominant writing system of the ancient Near East for 3,000 years, were not artists. They were administrators, trained in schools called Edaba, the tablet houses, where they copied lists and practiced signs until the system became reflex. The curriculum has survived. It consisted largely of lists, trees, animals, fish, birds, professions, cities. The world rendered as inventory. And yet something else crept in, as it always does when humans are given tools for expression. Within a few centuries of the first administrative tablets, the Sumerians were writing hymns, laments, the earliest version of a story about a great flood, predating the biblical account by more than 1,000 years. A poem about a king named Gilgamesh, who was 2/3 divine and could not accept that the remaining third would die. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest substantial work of literature in human history. It is also, read carefully, a document about power, about what it costs, what it cannot buy, and what happens to the men who accumulate too much of it. Gilgamesh builds walls around Uruk. He exhausts his people with labor. He is so overwhelming in his presence that the gods create a companion for him, Enkidu, simply to give him somewhere to put his energy. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh does something no king before him had done in any surviving text. He mourns. He refuses to accept the loss. He leaves his city and travels to the ends of the earth, searching for the secret of immortality, and fails, and returns, and looks at the walls he built and understands, finally, that this is what remains, not the man, the walls. The Sumerian kings who followed Gilgamesh, historical rather than legendary, though the line between the two was not clearly drawn, inherited a political system that was already, by 2700 BCE, remarkably sophisticated. The city-state was the fundamental unit. Each city had its patron deity, its temple complex, its palace administration, its surrounding agricultural land. The temple was not separate from the economy. It was the economy. The priests managed the granaries, the workshops, the labor pools. Bronze moved through this system as both tool and symbol. A bronze weapon in the hands of a Sumerian soldier was a statement of institutional power. The palace or temple had the resources to acquire tin, the craftsmen to work it, the logistics to arm and supply a force. A city without bronze was a city at a disadvantage. It could feel in every negotiation, every border dispute, every moment when a neighboring city-state decided to test the extent of its own ambition. The wars of early Sumer were not wars of annihilation. They were wars of control, over irrigation canals, over trade routes, over the agricultural land that fed the cities. The Stele of the Vultures, carved around 2450 BCE to commemorate a victory by the city of Lagash over its rival Umma, shows soldiers in bronze helmets advancing in tight formation behind a wall of shields. It is the earliest depiction of an army fighting as a unit rather than as individual warriors. Someone had understood that bronze changed not just what a weapon could do, but how men could fight together. The phalanx, or something very like it, appears here, 4,000 years before the Greeks would be credited with its invention. The scribes recorded the victory. They recorded the casualties. They recorded the terms of the peace that followed, and the boundary stones placed to mark the agreed border, and the names of the officials who witnessed the agreement. They recorded everything. That was their function. To make the state legible to itself, to transform the chaos of human activity into something that could be stored, retrieved, verified. What the tablets could not record was the pressure building at the edges of the system. The cities growing faster than their agricultural base could support. The trade routes lengthening, becoming more complex, more vulnerable to disruption. The dependency on bronze deepening in every sector of society: military, ceremonial, agricultural, domestic. The scribes pressed their styluses into wet clay and recorded what they could see. What was coming left no mark until it arrived. They built for eternity and meant it literally, not as metaphor, not as aspiration. The architects of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, working under the direct authority of a man they believed to be a god incarnate, designed structures intended to function forever, to house a divine body through an infinite afterlife, to anchor the soul of the king to the physical world with enough stone that neither time nor chaos could undo the connection. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BCE. It remained the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. The precision of its construction, the alignment to true north, the near-perfect right angles of its base, the fit of its limestone blocks so tight that a sheet of paper cannot be passed between them, was achieved without iron tools, without wheeled vehicles capable of carrying the loads involved, without any technology that the modern world would recognize as adequate to the task. What they had instead was organization, a state apparatus of extraordinary sophistication, capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of workers, feeding them, housing them, managing their labor in rotating shifts across decades of continuous construction. The workers were not slaves. The archaeological evidence is clear on this. The villages built for them, the medical care recorded in their bones, the rations documented in administrative papyri. They were citizens of a state performing a function the state considered sacred. Egypt in the Old Kingdom was something the Bronze Age had not yet produced anywhere else. A unified territorial state under a single authority, stable enough to sustain multi-generational projects. The pharaoh was not merely a king. He was the point of connection between the human world and the divine order, the figure whose proper functioning kept the Nile flooding, the crops growing, the cosmos from collapsing into chaos. Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of cosmic order, was not a passive state. It required maintenance. It required the pharaoh. This theology had practical consequences. A state built around the indispensability of one figure is a state with a specific vulnerability, and the Old Kingdom would eventually discover it. But not yet. In 2500 BCE, the system was working with a confidence that expressed itself in stone on a scale that has never been equaled. Bronze moved through Egypt differently than it moved through Mesopotamia. Egypt had copper. The mines of the Mycenae were among the most productive in the ancient world, worked by expeditions sent directly by the pharaoh and recorded in inscriptions that tracked every aspect of the operation. What Egypt lacked, like everyone else, was tin. The solution was trade, with the Levant, with Mesopotamia, with Cyprus, with trading partners whose names appear in Egyptian records without always being fully understood. The bronze that resulted armed the pharaoh's soldiers, equipped his craftsmen, furnished his temples. But in Egypt, more than anywhere else, bronze carried a ceremonial weight that went beyond utility. A bronze statue of a deity was not a representation, it was a vessel. The material mattered, its permanence, its resistance to decay, its ability to be shaped into precise and enduring form made it appropriate for objects that were meant to exist outside ordinary time. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered intact in 1922 and dated to around 1323 BCE, late in the Bronze Age, centuries after the Old Kingdom, contained hundreds of bronze objects, tools, weapons, ritual implements, a pair of bronze trumpets that, when played by a BBC correspondent shortly after the discovery, produced a sound described by those present as unlike anything they had heard, raw, penetrating, ancient in a way that the word ancient does not usually manage to convey. That sound had last been heard more than 3,000 years earlier. Someone had put those trumpets in the tomb, expecting them to be used again, expecting the system, the state, the religion, the eternal order maintained by the pharaoh's proper burial, to continue functioning indefinitely. The Old Kingdom ended around 2181 BCE, not with conquest, but with fragmentation, a period of drought, failed harvests, provincial governors who had accumulated enough power to stop deferring to a central authority that could no longer demonstrate its divine mandate by keeping the population fed. The first intermediate period, the name historians give to the chaos that followed, lasted over a century. Egypt recovered. It always recovered. That was one of the distinctive features of Egyptian civilization, its capacity for reconstitution, for finding the thread of continuity even after the fabric had torn. The Middle Kingdom rose from the fragmentation. Then the New Kingdom, the era of Ramesses and Thutmose and the great military campaigns into the Levant, rose from the disruption that followed. But each recovery was slightly different from what had come before. Each reconstitution left something out, added something new, adjusted the balance between the pharaoh's divine authority and the practical power of the administrators and priests who made the system function. The Egypt of the New Kingdom was not the Egypt of the Old Kingdom, wearing different clothes. It was a civilization that had learned, through collapse and recovery, that eternity required constant renegotiation. The pyramids still stood through all of it. They stood because they were built to stand, because the men who designed them had understood, at some level, that the institution they were serving might not last, and had decided to make the monument outlast the institution. In the desert outside Giza, the stone held its angles. The alignment to true north did not drift. The blocks fit as tightly as they had the day they were placed. Inside, in the darkness that had not been broken in 4,000 years, the air was still. The king for whom all of this had been built was gone. The gods he had served were already changing their names. A ship left the coast of Canaan, carrying copper ingots, tin, cedar logs, olive oil, and a consignment of Cypriote pottery that no one on board had ordered and no one at the destination was expecting. This was not unusual. The merchants of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean did not operate on clean manifests and pre-agreed inventories. They operated on opportunity, on the knowledge that somewhere along the route someone would want what they had, and that the art of the trade was knowing before you arrived what that something might be. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of southern Turkey in 1982 and dated to around 1300 BCE, contained goods from at least 7 distinct cultures: Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, Mycenae in Greece, the Levant, Anatolia, Nubia. A single vessel, crewed by men whose origins we cannot fully determine, carrying the output of half the known world toward a destination that sank with the ship. The Mediterranean in the Bronze Age was not a barrier. It was a road with no fixed surface, no maintained edges, no authority responsible for its upkeep, but a road nonetheless, traveled by men who understood its currents and its seasons with the precision of long practice. The summer winds that pushed ships westward along the northern coast. The winter storms that closed the sea for months and compressed all maritime trade into the navigable window between them. The ships themselves were small by any standard that followed. The Uluburun vessel was perhaps 15 meters long. It carried, by modern estimates, around 20 tons of cargo, 10 tons of copper ingots alone, stacked in the hold in the shape of oxides, the standardized form that made them easier to count and carry. 20 tons. A modern container ship carries 20,000. The Bronze Age Mediterranean ran on vessels that would be considered recreational craft today, crewed by a handful of men, crossing open water with no instruments beyond the stars and accumulated knowledge. And yet the network they sustained was genuinely global in its reach and consequences. Tin from Afghanistan moving westward, copper from Cyprus moving in every direction, grain from Egypt feeding populations that could not grow enough of their own, textiles from Mesopotamia, wool processed in institutional workshops, dyed with colors whose formulas were closely guarded, traded for raw materials that Mesopotamia could not produce. Amber from the Baltic coast, carried overland through Europe and across the sea, appearing in tombs in Greece and Egypt as an exotic luxury, whose origin most of its owners could not have located on any map they possessed. The obsidian trade is perhaps the most striking example of how far the network extended before anyone thought to document it systematically. Obsidian, volcanic glass, extraordinarily sharp, useful for cutting tools before bronze made it largely obsolete, was traded across the Mediterranean and the Near East for thousands of years before the Bronze Age began. Geochemical analysis of obsidian artifacts can identify, with precision, the specific volcanic source from which the stone came. Obsidian from the island of Melos has been found on the Greek mainland in contexts dating to 10,000 BCE. 10,000 years before the Common Era, someone was making regular sea crossings to a specific island to obtain a specific material and carry it home. The Bronze Age inherited this tradition and expanded it beyond anything the Neolithic traders could have imagined. What changed was not the human impulse to acquire what was distant. That impulse is as old as the species. What changed was the institutional infrastructure supporting it. The palace economies of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Aegean were not merely consumers of traded goods. They were organizers of trade, investors in voyages, guarantors of the agreements that made long-distance exchange possible. A merchant sailing from Ugarit to Cyprus in 1400 BCE did not go as a private individual taking a personal risk. He went as an agent of a system, backed by the authority of a palace that had negotiated diplomatic relationships with the destination, that had established protocols for the treatment of foreign merchants, that had created, in effect, the conditions under which trust between strangers was possible. This was the Bronze Age's most underappreciated achievement. Not the pyramids, not the weapons, not the writing. The achievement was trust at scale. The construction of a system in which a man could leave his home, cross open water, arrive in a city where no one knew him, conduct business worth the equivalent of years of ordinary labor, and return safely with the agreed payment. This happened thousands of times, across centuries, in a world without banks, without insurance, without courts capable of enforcing contracts across national borders. It happened because the palace economies needed it to happen, and had developed the diplomatic machinery to make it possible. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt, dating to the 14th century BCE, reveal the texture of these relationships with startling intimacy. Kings addressing each other as brothers, requests for gold, for craftsmen, for specific materials unavailable at home, complaints about gifts deemed insufficient, the careful maintenance of relationships across distances that made face-to-face negotiation impossible. If this story is settled somewhere unexpected, if the weight of what was built here and what was at stake has registered in a way you didn't anticipate, a like is the quietest way to say so. The network was at its most elaborate, its most interconnected, its most breathtakingly dependent on the continued functioning of every node within it. which meant it was also, though no one had the language for this yet, at its most fragile. The ship from Canaan reached open water. The crew adjusted the sail. Somewhere ahead, past the horizon, a city was waiting for copper it did not yet know it needed. The palace had no walls. Not because the builders had forgotten, not because the resources were unavailable. A civilization capable of constructing a complex of over 1,000 rooms across multiple stories, with running water, with drainage systems, with storage magazines that could hold the agricultural output of an entire region, was not a civilization that lacked the capacity to build a defensive perimeter. The walls were absent because someone had decided they were unnecessary. Knossos, on the northern coast of Crete, was the center of what we call the Minoan civilization, a name given by the archaeologist Arthur Evans, who excavated the site beginning in 1900 CE, after the legendary king Minos of Greek mythology. The Minoans themselves left no texts we have fully deciphered. Linear A, their writing system, remains unread. What we know of them comes from their architecture, their art, their trade goods found across the Mediterranean, and the careful, sometimes overconfident interpretations of the people who dug them up. What the art shows is striking, not war, not conquest, not the triumphant military imagery that dominates the visual culture of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The frescoes of Knossos show dolphins, flowers, young men and women leaping over the backs of bulls in a ritual that may have been athletic, may have been religious, may have been both simultaneously in a way that our categories do not easily accommodate. The figures are fluid, almost modern in their dynamism. They are not arranged in the rigid hierarchies of Egyptian painting. They move. Crete's position in the Aegean gave it a natural advantage that partially explains the confidence implied by those missing walls. An island large enough to be agriculturally self-sufficient, close enough to the mainland trade routes to participate fully in the Bronze Age network, and surrounded by water that served as both barrier and highway. The Minoan thalassocracy, their dominance of the sea, was not a military achievement in the conventional sense. It was a commercial one. They controlled trade not by force, but by being indispensable to it. Their ships carried Cretan goods, pottery, oil, textiles. The distinctive Minoan aesthetic that spread across the Aegean like a cultural current, and returned with copper from Cyprus, tin from sources further east, grain from Egypt, silver from the Aegean islands. The palace at Knossos was not merely a royal residence. It was a redistribution center, a warehouse, a workshop complex, an administrative hub. The linear A tablets found there record transactions with the same meticulous attention to quantity and category that the Sumerian scribes had applied in Mesopotamia centuries earlier. The Minoans traded with Egypt. Egyptian records mention the Keftiu, almost certainly the Cretans, as bearers of tribute, though the Minoan perspective would likely have described the same exchange as commerce between equals. The frescoes at the Egyptian tomb of Rekhmire, vizier to Thutmose III, around 1450 BCE, show figures in Minoan dress carrying Minoan vessels. The visual record of two civilizations in contact, each finding the other worth depicting. What happened to the Minoans is a question that archaeology has been circling for over a century without fully resolving. The eruption of Thera, the volcanic island now known as Santorini, approximately 110 kilometers north of Crete, occurred sometime around 1600 BCE, give or take several decades, depending on which dating method is applied. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Holocene. The tsunamis it generated would have struck the northern coast of Crete with force sufficient to destroy harbor installations and coastal settlements. But Knossos survived Thera. The palace continued to function for at least another century and a half after the eruption, which means the eruption, devastating as it was, did not end the Minoans. Something else did, or something else completed what the eruption had begun. Around 1450 BCE, the palace complexes of Crete, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, show evidence of destruction, fire, abandonment, the end of Linear A as an administrative language, replaced, at Knossos alone, by Linear B, the writing system of the Mycenaean Greeks, who appear to have occupied the palace and continued its administrative functions under new management. The Mycenaeans had been watching Crete for generations, learning from it, adopting its art, its religious imagery, its architectural sensibilities, its trade connections. The relationship between Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece was one of the Bronze Age's most complex cultural exchanges, influence flowing in both directions, the older civilization shaping the younger eventually absorbing the older in ways that are still not fully understood. At Knossos, after the Mycenaean takeover, the administrative records continue. The palace still functions, the redistribution still happens. But the writing is different, the language is different, the people giving orders are different. The dolphins in the frescoes do not notice. They move through painted water with the same fluid confidence they always had, leaping, diving, indifferent to the question of who is watching them now and what language those watchers speak. The palace that needed no walls had been entered anyway. Not through force, through time, through the slow pressure of a world that was changing faster than any single civilization could track. The king of the Hittites sent a letter to the pharaoh of Egypt, explaining why he could not send the iron that had been requested. The letter survives. It was found at the site of the Hittite capital Hattusa, in what is now north-central Turkey, among thousands of clay tablets that represent one of the most complete diplomatic archives of the ancient world. The king, most likely Hattusili III, writing sometime around 1260 BCE, tells Ramesses II that the iron is not ready, that the season is wrong, that the craftsmen have not finished. He will send a single iron dagger as a gesture of goodwill. The full shipment must wait. The dagger matters more than the letter. Iron, in the Bronze Age, was not a common material. It was rare, difficult to work, imperfectly understood, and associated, in the Hittite world and elsewhere, with the sky. Meteoric iron, fallen from above, had been worked into ceremonial objects for centuries before anyone understood how to smelt iron ore consistently. The Egyptians called it the metal of heaven. The Hittites appear to have understood, earlier than most, that iron smelted from terrestrial ore could produce something harder than bronze, but the technology for doing it reliably was not yet fully developed. The Hittites sat at the crossroads of the Bronze Age world in a way that made them simultaneously powerful and perpetually threatened. Their empire, at its height in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the borders of Mesopotamia, from the Black Sea coast to the northern reaches of the Levant. They controlled the overland routes that connected east and west. They had the copper deposits of Anatolia within their territory. They had the agricultural land of the Anatolian plateau. What they did not have was a coast, not a good one, not one that gave them easy access to the maritime trade that the Minoans and later the Mycenaeans had turned into the foundation of their power. So the Hittites became by necessity a land power. And land powers in the Bronze Age fought differently than maritime ones. They built chariot forces, the armored strike weapon of the era, requiring bronze fittings, trained horses, skilled drivers, and the kind of flat terrain that the Anatolian plateau provided in abundance. A Hittite army on the move was a logistical operation of considerable complexity, sustained by administrative systems that the Hittite kings had developed over generations of continuous warfare. They fought the Egyptians, they fought the Mycenaeans, they fought the Assyrians to their east and the Kaska peoples to their north, a semi-nomadic group that raided the Hittite heartland with sufficient regularity to appear in the royal annals as a persistent, low-grade emergency. The Hittites were not a civilization that could afford complacency. Every generation produced a new threat from a new direction, and the kings who survived were the ones who understood that military force and diplomatic maneuvering were not alternatives but complements. The Hittite diplomatic archive is extraordinary for what it reveals about how the Bronze Age great powers managed their relationships. Treaties with vassal states, specifying obligations in precise legal language, correspondence with Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, Ugarit, Alatia, the name used for Cyprus, in which the tone shifts depending on whether the relationship is between equals or between superior and subordinate. The Hittites were meticulous about this distinction. A letter to a great king began differently than a letter to a lesser one, and the archive preserves both. What the archive also preserves is anxiety. Letters from vassal cities reporting enemy movements, requests for military assistance that arrived too late, or were answered too slowly, or went unanswered entirely. A letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alatia, written in the final years before the collapse, describing enemy ships sighted offshore. The king of Alatia responding that he has sent his own ships, but they have gone elsewhere and cannot be recalled. The Hittites understood before most that the Bronze Age system had a structural weakness. A network of interdependent states, each relying on the others for resources and security, was only as strong as its ability to respond to crisis simultaneously from multiple directions. The Hittite kings spent their reigns plugging gaps, military campaigns to the south, diplomatic negotiations to the east, construction of fortifications to the north. They were holding together a system they had not designed and could not fully control. Hattusha itself, the capital, was a city of considerable ambition. Its walls, the Hittites, unlike the Minoans believed in walls, extended for 6 kilometers around the site, incorporating towers and gates decorated with stone lions and sphinxes. The great temple in the lower city was one of the largest religious structures of the Bronze Age. The royal archives, stored in the administrative buildings of the upper city, contained not only diplomatic correspondence but religious texts, mythological narratives, medical knowledge, horse training manuals. The horse training manuals are perhaps the most unexpected survival. Written by a man named Kikali, a Mitanni specialist brought to the Hittite court around 1400 BCE. They describe a training regimen for chariot horses so detailed and so technically sophisticated that modern equestrians have tested it and found it sound. 4,000 years old, written on clay tablets in a dead language, and still applicable to the animals it was designed for. The Hittites knew things. That is what the archive demonstrates, repeatedly and across every domain it touches. They knew how to train horses and how to negotiate treaties and how to manage a multi-ethnic empire across a vast territory with inadequate roads and no reliable communication technology beyond the messenger on foot or horseback. What they did not know, what no one knew, in the 13th century BCE, was that the system sustaining all of it was already beginning to strain at its edges. That the network of trade and diplomacy and military alliance that had held the Bronze Age world together for centuries was approaching a threshold it had never crossed before. The iron dagger was sent to Egypt as promised, a gesture of goodwill between great kings who had fought each other to exhaustion and decided, finally, that exhaustion was not a strategy. In the Hittite archives, the correspondence continued. Letters sent, letters received. Letters that would never be answered because the city they were sent to no longer existed by the time a reply could have arrived. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides were lying. Both sides knew it. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in the spring of 1274 BCE on the banks of the Orontes River in what is now Syria, was the largest chariot engagement in recorded history. Ramesses the Sioux of Egypt led a force of perhaps 20,000 men in 4 divisions, advancing toward the Hittite-controlled city of Kadesh with the confidence of a king who had been told by his own intelligence network that the Hittite army was still far to the north. The intelligence was wrong. The Hittites, under Muwatalli II, had positioned their forces, perhaps 35,000 men, with 3,000 chariots, behind the city, invisible until the moment they chose not to be. What followed was a near catastrophe for Egypt that Ramesses spent the rest of his exceptionally long reign recasting as a triumph. The Hittite chariots broke through the Egyptian lines. 2 of the 4 Egyptian divisions collapsed. Ramesses himself, according to the account he commissioned and had carved onto the walls of 5 separate temples, was left almost alone on the battlefield, surrounded by enemies, and won the day through personal valor and divine intervention. The Hittite records tell a different story. Muwatalli writes to the king of Ugarit that he has defeated the Egyptian army. The Egyptian records describe a great victory. Both accounts agree on one point, without stating it directly. Neither side was able to destroy the other. The battle ended. The armies separated. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. The military outcome was, in the most precise sense, a draw. But draws between great powers are never merely draws. They are negotiations conducted with weapons, ending not in victory, but in the recognition that victory, in this particular configuration of forces, is not available. What Kadesh produced was not a winner. It produced a treaty. The Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, concluded approximately 16 years after the battle, around 1258 BCE, is the oldest surviving international peace agreement in human history. 2 copies exist, one in Egyptian hieroglyphics, one in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the Bronze Age. A replica of the Akkadian version hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York, chosen as a symbol of the possibility of negotiated peace between powers that have exhausted themselves in conflict. The treaty is a remarkable document. It establishes non-aggression between Egypt and Hatti. It creates a mutual defense clause. If a third party attacks either signatory, the other is obligated to assist. It addresses the extradition of political refugees, specifying that they must be returned without punishment, a clause whose inclusion suggests that both sides had recent experience with the problem. It invokes the gods of both nations as witnesses and guarantors, a list that runs to over 1,000 deities by some counts. The entire available supernatural order, called to observe what 2 exhausted kings had agreed. What the treaty does not say is as revealing as what it does. It does not declare either king the victor. It does not impose reparations. It does not redraw borders significantly. It acknowledges, without stating, that the existing balance of power is approximately what it will remain, and that maintaining it is preferable to the alternative. The alternative had been demonstrated at Kadesh. Chariot against chariot, bronze against bronze, the full military apparatus of 2 of the most powerful states in the world deployed against each other at maximum effort. And the result was nothing. Or rather, the result was the recognition that nothing was available through force that could not be obtained more cheaply through negotiation. Ramesses and the Hittite king. By the time the treaty was signed, Hattusili III had replaced Muwatalli, exchanged letters afterward that read, in places, almost warmly. Hattusili's wife wrote to the Egyptian queen. The Hittite king requested Egyptian physicians for his own ailments. A royal marriage was arranged. A Hittite princess sent to Egypt to become one of Ramesses's wives. The mechanics of diplomatic normalization performed across the full distance of the Bronze Age world by men who had tried to kill each other and decided that the arrangement was unsustainable. The treaty held. For the remaining decades of both reigns, Egypt and Hatti maintained the agreement, coordinated against shared threats, continued their correspondence. It is one of the Bronze Age's most striking achievements. Not a pyramid, not a palace, not a weapons technology, but a piece of negotiated text that kept two great powers from destroying each other during the most dangerous period either had faced. What neither the Egyptians nor the Hittites could negotiate their way out of was what was coming from outside their shared border. The threats they had prepared for, each other, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the familiar enemies whose capabilities and intentions could be assessed and managed, were not the threats that would end them. The treaty, carved in silver and sealed with the seals of both kings, was stored in the Hittite archive at Hattusa. The Egyptian copy was inscribed on temple walls at Karnak and Ramesseum, where it could be read, where it was meant to be read, by anyone who passed through. Ramesses lived to approximately 90 years of age, outlasting most of his sons, outlasting the immediate crisis, outlasting the system that had produced both the battle and the treaty. His mummy, discovered in 1881, still shows the physique of a tall, broad-shouldered man. His red hair had faded to white. His arthritis had been severe in his final years. He had seen more of the Bronze Age than almost anyone. He had not seen enough of it to see what was coming next. If you wanted to understand the Bronze Age world, you went to Ugarit. Not because it was the largest city. It was not. Not because it had the most powerful army. It did not. Ugarit, situated on the northern coast of what is now Syria, was perhaps 35 hectares at its greatest extent, a modest footprint by the standards of Mesopotamia or Egypt. What made it indispensable was not its size but its position. Ugarit sat at the intersection of every major trade route in the eastern Mediterranean. Ships from Cyprus arrived in its harbor. Caravans from Mesopotamia ended their journeys at its gates. Egyptian merchants, Mycenaean traders, Hittite diplomats, Assyrian businessmen, all of them passed through Ugarit because Ugarit was where the routes converged. The city had been inhabited since the Neolithic period, but it reached its fullest expression in the Late Bronze Age, between approximately 1400 and 1185 BCE. During those 2 centuries, it was one of the most cosmopolitan places on Earth. Its population spoke multiple languages: Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hurrian, Egyptian, Cypriot, Hittite, and others that appear in the tablets, without always being fully identified. Its scribes were trained in cuneiform, but also developed an alphabetic writing system, one of the earliest true alphabets in the archaeological record, with 22 consonantal signs that could represent any word in the language without requiring years of specialized training to master. That alphabet matters. The Ugaritic alphabet is a direct ancestor of the Phoenician alphabet, which is the ancestor of the Greek alphabet, which is the ancestor of the Latin alphabet, in which these words are written. The system of notation you are using to process this sentence has its roots in a city that was destroyed and abandoned more than 3,000 years ago and forgotten so completely that its location was unknown until a farmer's plough struck a buried tomb in 1928. The tablets found at Ugarit, thousands of them in multiple languages covering every aspect of urban life, are among the most revealing documents of the Bronze Age. They include diplomatic correspondence with the great powers, commercial contracts between merchants, legal records, religious texts, including mythological narratives about the Canaanite gods Baal and El and Mot that illuminate the religious world from which the Hebrew Bible would later emerge, a veterinary text describing the treatment of sick horses, a list of personnel assigned to the palace guard, a letter from a mother to a son asking why he has not written. The mother's letter is undated, as most personal correspondence in the ancient world is undated, but it carries the weight of a recognizable human moment, the combination of worry and mild reproach that crosses every cultural boundary and every historical period. Her son was somewhere in the Bronze Age world, conducting business or serving in some official capacity, and she had not heard from him, and she wanted to know why. Whether he replied is not recorded. Whether the reply arrived is not recorded. What is recorded in the material evidence of the site itself is that Ugarit in the 13th century BCE was a city at the height of its confidence. The royal palace, one of the largest in the Bronze Age Levant, covering approximately 1 hectare, contained reception halls, administrative quarters, a scriptorium where scribes worked, a garden and a drainage system that channeled water away from the foundations with engineering precision. The houses of wealthy merchants, excavated in the residential quarter, contained their own archive rooms, their own collections of tablets, their own inventories of goods that moved through the city in quantities that still impress when converted to modern equivalents. Bronze was everywhere, in the workshops as raw material and finished product, in the palace as ritual object and administrative tool, in the harbour as cargo arriving and departing on ships whose names sometimes appear in the records, the ship of a specific merchant, the vessel of a named captain, a delivery expected from Cyprus that the palace administrator had noted in his inventory of outstanding receipts. The harbour of Ugarit, actually a subsidiary port called Mahadu, approximately 1 kilometre from the city, was one of the busiest in the Mediterranean. Ships arrived from every direction. The customs records that survive, fragmentary but legible, show a city extracting value from the flow of goods through it with the systematic efficiency of an institution that had been doing this for generations and had refined the process to a high art. Ugarit paid tribute to the Hittites. It maintained diplomatic relations with Egypt. It traded with Cyprus, with Mycenae in Greece, with Assyria, with Babylonia. It was, in the language of modern systems theory, a hub, a node in the network through which a disproportionate share of the network's traffic flowed, which meant that it was also a node whose failure would be felt throughout the system in ways that a peripheral city's failure would not. The last texts from Ugarit were written sometime around 1185 BCE. They were found, in the excavation of the city, in a kiln. Tablets that had been prepared for firing and never removed, preserved by the very fire that destroyed the building around them. Among them is a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Al-Ashir, describing enemy ships offshore, a request for assistance, a description of the city's military resources, already deployed elsewhere, already committed to other crises. The letter was never sent. It was found in the kiln where it was waiting to be fired, in a city that had stopped existing before the firing was complete. The scribes who wrote it were gone. The merchants whose ships filled the harbor were gone. The mother who had written to her son asking why he had not written, whatever had become of her, whatever had become of him, was gone. The tablets remained, fired harder than intended by the burning of the city around them, preserved by the catastrophe that ended the world they recorded. Ugarit knew everything that was happening in the Bronze Age world, until the day it knew nothing at all. Consider what it took to make a single bronze sword. The copper came from Cyprus, mined from deposits that had been worked for centuries by men who understood the ore well enough to extract it efficiently, but not well enough to explain the chemistry involved. Smelted on site into oxide ingots, the standardized form, four-handled, approximately 29 kilograms each, and loaded onto ships in the harbor at Enkomi or Kitin, carried west to the Aegean or south to Egypt or east to the Levantine coast, depending on the season and the market and the judgment of the merchant who owned the cargo. The tin came from further away, Afghanistan most likely for the eastern Mediterranean trade, Cornwall possibly for the western routes, though the chain of hands through which Cornish tin passed before it reached a Mycenaean workshop was long enough that the workshop's craftsmen would have had no way of knowing where it originated. It moved overland and by sea through intermediaries who added their margin at each stage, arriving finally at the same destination as the copper, a workshop, a craftsman, a fire hot enough to melt both metals together into something neither of them was alone. The craftsman who made the sword knew his ratios. 10 parts copper to 1 part tin, approximately. The precise proportion that produced the hardest, most workable alloy. He knew his temperatures. He knew how to pour the molten bronze into a clay mold, and when to remove it, and how to work the cooling metal with hammers that were themselves made of bronze. He knew how to finish the blade, how to work the edge, how to attach the hilt. What he did not know, could not have known, had no framework for knowing, was that the sword in his hands was the product of a supply chain spanning 3,000 kilometers, involving a dozen languages, passing through the hands of perhaps 50 different people across several years of transit, sustained by diplomatic agreements between great powers and commercial relationships between merchants and the accumulated navigational knowledge of sailors who had learnt the Mediterranean's winds and currents across generations of practice. He knew how to make the sword. The system made the sword possible. The Late Bronze Age world system, the term used by archaeologist Eric Klein and others to describe the interconnected network of civilizations that operated across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East between approximately 1500 and 1200 BCE, was, by any reasonable measure, the most complex international order the world had yet produced. Its members included Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae in Greece, Minoan Crete in its final decades, Cyprus, Ugarit, and the other city-states of the Levant, Assyria, Babylonia, and Mitanni. These were not isolated civilizations that happened to trade occasionally. They were interdependent systems that could not fully function without each other. Egypt needed tin for bronze and timber for ships, neither of which it had in sufficient quantities domestically. The Hittites needed grain. Their plateau agriculture was productive, but vulnerable to drought. The Mycenaean palaces needed copper, and the luxury goods that demonstrated palatial authority to their populations. Cyprus needed grain and finished goods in exchange for the copper that was its primary export. Every node in the network had dependencies, and every dependency was a thread connecting it to every other node. The strength of a network is also its vulnerability. A system in which everything depends on everything else is a system that distributes both prosperity and disruption with equal efficiency. When the copper flowed freely, every civilization in the network benefited. When a drought reduced, Egypt's grain surplus, the Hittites felt it. When a political crisis closed the tin routes from the east, workshops from Mycenae to Memphis found themselves without a critical input. The system had survived disruptions before. Individual crises, a palace destroyed, a trade route closed, a political relationship severed, had been absorbed without systemic failure. The network had redundancy, or something that functioned like it. If one route closed, merchants found another. If one city fell, the trade shifted to a neighboring port. The system was resilient, in the way that complex systems are resilient, until they are not. What the system had never faced was simultaneous disruption across multiple nodes. A crisis that was not local but general. A failure that did not originate in one place and spread, but emerged everywhere at once, or close enough to everywhere that the distinction did not matter for practical purposes. In the 13th century BCE, the system was at its peak. The Amarna letters, the Ugaritic archives, the Hittite diplomatic records, all of them describe a world of intense, continuous, multi-directional exchange. Kings corresponding with kings. Merchants tracking shipments across the full width of the Mediterranean. Craftsmen producing goods for markets they would never visit, sustained by materials that arrived from sources they could not name. If you have stayed with this series through 10 parts, through the workshops and the trade routes and the palaces and the treaties, consider leaving a comment about which civilization has surprised you most. The answer is different for everyone, and the conversation in those comments has become something worth being part of. The system was at its most elaborate, its most interconnected, its most breathtakingly dependent on the continued functioning of every node within it. And in the archives of Hattusa, in the harbour of Ugarit, in the palace storerooms of Mycenae, the first letters were arriving that described things no one had a framework to explain. Ships on the horizon, cities that had stopped responding, harvests that had failed for the second year in succession and then the third. The craftsman finished the sword. He tested the edge. It held. Outside the workshop, the world that had made the sword possible was already, in ways no one could yet see clearly, beginning to come apart. They had no name for themselves. The name they carry in history was given to them by the people they terrified. The Sea Peoples, a term that appears in Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE, were not a single people. They were not a nation, not a tribe, not an army, in the conventional sense of an organized force operating under unified command toward a defined strategic objective. They were, as best as the evidence allows us to reconstruct, a movement, a migration, a confluence of displaced populations from multiple origins, moving through the eastern Mediterranean with a momentum that the established powers of the Bronze Age found impossible to stop. Ramesses III recorded their arrival on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, in one of the most detailed military inscriptions of the ancient world. The reliefs show naval battles in the Nile Delta, Egyptian archers firing from the banks and from their own vessels into a mass of enemy ships. The Sea Peoples' warriors depicted with distinctive feathered headdresses and round shields. Their ships loaded, not just with fighters, but with women, children, and cattle. This was not a raid. This was a relocation. People moving with everything they owned, looking for somewhere to stop. Who were they? The question has occupied archaeologists and historians for over a century, without producing a consensus that satisfies everyone. The Egyptian texts name specific groups within the larger movement: the Peleset, the Tijeka, the Sheklish, the Danyan, the Weshish. Some of these names have been tentatively matched to known or partially known peoples. The Peleset are widely believed to be the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible, who settled on the southern Levantine coast after the Egyptian campaigns and established a distinctive material culture that archaeology can trace clearly. The Denyen may be connected to the Danans, one of Homer's names for the Greeks. The Shekelish may have origins in Sicily. May, possibly, are widely believed to be. The language of Bronze Age collapse scholarship is saturated with qualification, and for good reason. The evidence is fragmentary, the identifications are contested, and the temptation to connect the Sea Peoples to known later populations, the Greeks, the Philistines, the Etruscans, has repeatedly produced theories that seemed compelling until the next excavation season complicated them. What is less contested is the effect. Wherever the Sea Peoples moved, the existing order did not survive intact. Ugarit was destroyed. The Hittite Empire collapsed. The Mycenaean palace system fell. Cyprus was disrupted. The Levantine city-states that had sustained the Bronze Age trade network were burned, abandoned, or fundamentally transformed. Egypt survived, but the Egypt that emerged from the encounter with the Sea Peoples was diminished, its Levantine empire gone, its international trade reduced, its administrative complexity contracted. The debate that has consumed Bronze Age scholarship for decades is whether the Sea Peoples caused the collapse or were themselves a symptom of it. The distinction matters more than it might initially appear. If the Sea Peoples caused the collapse, then the Bronze Age ended because of an external shock, a migration of displaced peoples whose pressure on the existing system was simply too great to absorb. If the Sea Peoples were a symptom, then the collapse was already underway before they arrived, driven by internal failures, climate change, drought, systems breakdown, the accumulated fragility of a network that had grown too complex and too interdependent to survive simultaneous disruptions. The current scholarly consensus, to the extent that one exists, leans toward the second interpretation. The Sea Peoples appear in the Egyptian records at a moment when the Bronze Age system was already under severe stress, when the droughts had been running for years, when the trade routes had already been disrupted, when the letters between great powers were already describing conditions that no one had a framework to address. The Sea Peoples may have been, in significant part, refugees from the same collapse they are accused of causing. Populations displaced by drought and political instability in the Aegean and Anatolia, moving south and east in search of stability, and finding instead that the stability they were looking for had already ended. The feathered headdresses in the Medinat Habu reliefs are among the most recognizable images of the ancient world. They have appeared in documentaries, in textbook illustrations, in popular histories of the Bronze Age collapse for over a century. They carry the visual weight of catastrophe, anonymous warriors from an uncertain origin, arriving at the edges of the civilized world with a momentum that civilization could not contain. But look at the ships again, the women and children, the cattle. These are not the ships of an invasion force that has left a home to return to. These are the ships of people who no longer have a home to return to, who have been moving possibly for years, possibly for a generation, through a world that was dissolving around them as they moved through it. The Peleset settled on the Levantine coast and became the Philistines. They built cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, with a material culture that shows both their foreign origins and their rapid adaptation to the Levantine environment. They made pottery in styles that mixed Aegean traditions with local ones. They built temples. They established trade connections. Within a few generations, they were, in most practical senses, a Levantine people. They had arrived as part of a catastrophe. They stayed to build something from what remained. In the Egyptian reliefs, Ramesses III stands in his chariot, larger than everyone around him in the convention of divine kingship, bow drawn, enemies falling beneath his wheels. He claimed total victory. The sea peoples were repelled. Egypt was saved. Egypt was saved. But the world those peoples had come from, the interconnected, interdependent, extraordinarily complex world of the Late Bronze Age, was not. The movement had no name for itself. It needed none. It was not an army with a strategy. It was a consequence looking for somewhere to land. The first sign was not a battle. It was a harvest that came up short. Not catastrophically short. Not the kind of failure that empties granaries in a single season and produces immediate famine. The kind of failure that is absorbed, noted in the administrative records as a deviation from expected yield, compensated for by drawing down reserves that were assumed to be sufficient. The kind of failure that, in a system operating with normal margins, would have been managed and forgotten within a year. But the margins were not normal. They had not been normal for some time. The palace economies of the Late Bronze Age had been optimized for efficiency over the preceding centuries, their redistribution systems refined, their trade networks extended, their administrative apparatus expanded to manage an increasingly complex flow of goods and obligations. Optimization and resilience are not the same thing. A system optimized for efficiency operates with reduced slack. It moves resources to where they are needed with precision. It eliminates redundancy because redundancy looks, from inside a functioning system, like waste. When the disruptions came, they came to a system that had spent generations removing its buffers. The climate evidence is now substantial. Pollen cores from lake sediments across the eastern Mediterranean, isotope analysis of stalagmites from caves in Turkey and Israel, the chemical signatures preserved in ancient wood and bone, all of it points in the same direction. Beginning around 1200 BCE and continuing for several decades, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged drought. Not uniformly, the evidence shows regional variation. Some areas hit harder than others, some years worse than the surrounding ones. But the overall pattern is clear. The rainfall that the Bronze Age agricultural systems had been calibrated to expect became unreliable, then inadequate, then in some regions catastrophically insufficient. The Hittite records show it first, almost clearly, because the Anatolian plateau was particularly vulnerable. A letter from the Hittite king to the pharaoh of Egypt, probably dating to the early 12th century BCE, requests grain with an urgency that the formal diplomatic language barely contains. It is a matter of life and death, the king writes. Send grain by ship as quickly as possible. The situation is severe. Egypt sent the grain. The records show it. Shipments of grain from Egypt to Hatti. The great power relationship functioning as designed. The mutual assistance clause of the treaty between them operating in practice. But the shipments were finite. Egypt's own agricultural surplus was under pressure. The Nile flood, which Egyptian agriculture depended on absolutely, and which had been reliable enough that the entire civilization had been built on the assumption of its reliability, had begun to vary in ways that the administrative system was not designed to accommodate. The letters that survive from the final decades of the Bronze Age read, in aggregate, like the correspondence of people who sense that something is wrong, but cannot identify what it is. A merchant writes that his shipment has been delayed. The usual explanation, the usual reassurance that it will arrive shortly. A palace administrator notes that the expected delivery of copper has not come and requests information about the delay. A king writes to a vassal, asking why the tribute has not been paid. And the vassal responds that the harvest was poor and the population is suffering, and he is doing what he can. The word that appears most frequently in the final archive of Ugarit is the word for grain. Requests for grain, promises of grain, complaints about the non-arrival of grain. A city that had been for 2 centuries one of the great commercial hubs of the Mediterranean was, in its final years, primarily concerned with food. Internal disruption followed the agricultural stress, with the inevitability of a sequence that had played out in smaller scales many times before. When harvests fail, the populations that depend on them move. When populations move, they cross boundaries that the existing political order has established and maintained. The Kaska peoples, who had raided the Hittite northern frontier for generations, intensified their pressure. Groups that appear in the Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples began their movement through the Aegean and toward the Levantine coast. The migrations were not the cause of the collapse. They were the human expression of it, populations in motion, because the places they had been were no longer viable. The palace systems that were the organizational backbone of the Bronze Age world were particularly vulnerable to this kind of cascading stress. They had been built on the assumption of surplus, of agricultural yields sufficient to sustain not just the farming population, but the specialized craftsmen, the administrators, the soldiers, the priests, the palace households that sat above the agricultural base and depended on it entirely. When the surplus contracted, the palace had to choose what to maintain and what to let go. Every choice created a new vulnerability. Soldiers not paid become unreliable. Trade networks not maintained atrophy. Craftsmen not supplied with raw materials stop producing. Administrative systems not staffed lose their capacity to coordinate the responses that might have addressed the original crisis. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were not simply large. They were interlocking, each component dependent on the others in ways that made the system robust during normal operation and brittle under stress. The letters continued to be sent. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the final archive. The correspondence did not stop when the situation became dire. It intensified. Kings writing to kings with requests that became more urgent as the months passed. Merchants writing to agents asking where their shipments were. Officials writing to superiors asking for instructions that the superiors did not have. A letter from the king of Al-Ashia, Cyprus, to the king of Ugarit, written in the period just before the destruction of Ugarit, describes enemy ships offshore. He cannot say how many. He cannot say who they are. He can say that 7 ships have already attacked the coast and done great damage, and that he is telling the king of Ugarit because the king of Ugarit should know, and because perhaps the king of Ugarit has information that Al-Ashia does not. The king of Ugarit wrote back. His letter, found in the kiln, never sent, describes his own situation. His infantry is in Hittite territory. His ships are on the Lycian coast. He has nothing left to send. He is, in the language of a man, trying to maintain the formal register of royal correspondence, while describing a situation for which the formal register has no adequate expression, doing what he can. The grain had stopped arriving. The copper had stopped arriving. The letters were still being written, still being sent, still being received. And then, in the space of a few decades, the writing stopped too. Not everywhere at once. The collapse was not a single event with a single date. It was a process, slow in some places, sudden in others, uneven in its timing and its depth and its consequences. But the direction was not uneven. The direction was consistent. The Bronze Age world was ending, and the people inside it were still writing letters asking what was happening, as though the answer might arrive before the question became irrelevant. The last letter from Ugarit was written in the middle of a sentence. Not literally, the tablet is complete. The text concludes with the conventional closing formulas of late Bronze Age correspondence. But the situation it describes is a sentence that was never finished. A crisis in progress. A request for help sent into a network that was no longer capable of responding. The letter was placed in a kiln to be fired, to be made permanent, to be sent. The city was destroyed before the firing was complete. The destruction of Ugarit occurred sometime around 1185 BCE, give or take a decade, depending on which chronological framework is applied. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous about the fact of destruction. A thick burn layer across the site, collapsed walls, artifacts abandoned in place, the kiln full of unfired tablets. What the evidence does not unambiguously establish is who destroyed it. The Sea Peoples are the traditional answer, and the letter describing enemy ships offshore supports the identification. But the destruction of Ugarit may also have involved internal breakdown, the withdrawal of the Hittite protection that had sustained the city's security for generations, the simple collapse of the administrative capacity to maintain walls and supply soldiers and coordinate the defense of a city that had never needed to be particularly good at defending itself because its value to the network had always been its protection. Ugarit was not primarily a military city, it was a commercial one. Its walls existed, but they were not its main protection. Its main protection was its usefulness, the fact that every great power in the Eastern Mediterranean had an interest in keeping it functioning, because Ugarit functioning was good for everyone who traded through it. When the great powers stopped being able to protect anything, including themselves, Ugarit's commercial value became irrelevant to the question of its survival. The tablets in the kiln are the most intimate record of the city's final hours. Among them, several letters that had arrived at Ugarit from other cities, describing conditions that mirror what Ugarit itself was experiencing. A letter from the prefect of Alashia warning that enemy ships had been sighted, and that the king of Ugarit should fortify his cities and position soldiers on the coast. A response being drafted, the letter found unfinished or finished but unsent, in which the king of Ugarit explains that he has no soldiers to position, that his army is elsewhere, that the situation is beyond his current capacity to address. There is a quality to these final letters that is difficult to describe without resorting to the word desperate, which is accurate but insufficient. The writers are not panicking. The formal conventions of Bronze Age correspondence require a composure that the scribes maintained even as everything around them was failing. They are doing what trained administrators do in a crisis. They are documenting it. They are sending information to the people who should be able to act on it, in the format that those people expect to receive, using the language and the conventions that the system has established for the transmission of urgent intelligence. The system had stopped being able to act on anything, but the documentation continued. Among the tablets from Ugarit's final archive is a letter from a man named Uwir Sharuma to the king, describing the arrival of enemy forces and the burning of villages in the surrounding territory. "The enemies have set fire to my villages," he writes, "and have done evil things in the country." The construction is formal, the vocabulary administrative. Evil things. A phrase that in the original language carries a bureaucratic weight, a category of action that the administrative system has a term for, that belongs in a report, that the king's scribes would know how to file. What evil things meant on the ground, in the villages that were burning, while Uwir Sharuma composed his report in the formal register of palatial correspondence, The tablet does not specify. It did not need to. The king would understand. The scribes would understand. The system had terms for these events, because these events had happened before, in smaller ways, in more contained crises, and the system had recorded and responded and continued. This time, the system did not continue. The excavation of Ugarit, begun by French archaeologists in 1929 and continuing intermittently to the present day, has produced one of the richest archives of the Late Bronze Age. The tablets in the kiln, preserved harder than they would have been by normal firing, their clay vitrified by the intense heat of the burning building, are among the best preserved documents of the period. They can be read, the language can be translated, the situations they describe can be understood. What cannot be understood, not fully, is the experience of being in the city during those final days. The moment when the administrative machinery that had sustained Ugarit for 2 centuries stopped having anything to administer. The moment when the scribes, who had spent their careers recording transactions and drafting correspondence, found that there were no more transactions to record and no one left to receive the correspondence. The potter's workshop near the kiln was abandoned with tools still in place. A house in the residential quarter contained a hoard of bronze and gold objects pushed into a corner. Someone hiding valuables before fleeing, or before something worse. The palace, when excavated, showed signs of rapid abandonment rather than systematic looting. Things were left that would not have been left if there had been time to take them. There was not time. The city that had been the center of the Bronze Age world, the node through which the network's most important traffic had flowed for 2 centuries, the place where merchants from 7 cultures had conducted business in 5 languages, under the administrative oversight of a palace that tracked every transaction. That city was abandoned in the middle of its ordinary operations. The kiln was still burning when the last people left. The tablets inside it were still soft. They hardened in the fire that consumed the building around them, preserved by the catastrophe that ended the world they recorded. The letter asking for help was never sent. The help was not coming anyway. The city was abandoned in the middle of a sentence. And the silence that followed lasted for centuries. Egypt survived. That is the fact that requires explanation. Every other major power of the Late Bronze Age, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Ugaritic city-states, the Cypriote palace economies, the Levantine trading networks, collapsed, contracted, or disappeared entirely within the space of a few decades around 1200 BCE. Egypt did not. The pharaoh continued to rule. The temples continued to function. The administrative apparatus that had managed the most complex state in the ancient world continued, in diminished form, to manage it. The Nile continued to flood. The scribes continued to write. But surviving is not the same as continuing. The Egypt that emerged from the crisis of the late 12th century BCE was not the Egypt that had entered it. The differences were not superficial, not the kind of changes that accumulate in any long-lived institution across generations of normal operation. They were structural. The collapse had removed things from Egypt that Egypt would not recover. The Levantine Empire was the most visible loss. For much of the New Kingdom period, Egypt had maintained a network of vassal states and garrison cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast, from the Sinai north through Canaan and into the southern Levant. These territories provided Egypt with timber, with trade access, with strategic depth, with the resources that a civilization built in a river valley without adequate forests needed to sustain its naval and construction programs. The loss of the Levantine Empire was not a military defeat in the conventional sense. It was an administrative withdrawal. The collapse of the system of relationships that had made Egyptian control possible, followed by the recognition that reconstituting those relationships was beyond Egypt's reduced capacity. Ramesses III, who ruled from approximately 1186 to 1155 BCE, was the last pharaoh of the New Kingdom to exercise anything resembling the power of his predecessors. His campaigns against the Sea Peoples, the naval battle in the Nile Delta, the land battles in the southern Levant, were genuine military achievements, recorded with genuine pride at Medinet Habu. But the Egypt that won those battles was already contracting. The administrative records of his reign show a state under financial stress, unable to pay its workers with the regularity that the system required. The strike at Deir el-Medina is perhaps the most striking symptom of that stress. The workers who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a specialized community of craftsmen who had served the pharaoh for generations, who understood their work as a sacred obligation, who had never, in the recorded history of the site, failed to appear for their scheduled shifts, stopped working. They gathered at the mortuary temples and refused to return to the tombs until they were paid the grain rations that were 2 months overdue. The records of this event, preserved in the Deir el-Medina archive with the same meticulous attention to administrative detail that characterized all Egyptian record-keeping, are extraordinary for what they reveal. The foreman negotiated with the workers. Officials were contacted. Partial payments were made. The workers returned. The cycle repeated multiple times across several years of Ramesses III's reign. The state that had built the pyramids, that had sustained multi-generational construction projects of incomprehensible scale, could not reliably pay its tomb workers their monthly grain ration. The assassination of Ramesses III, described in the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, a legal document recording the trial of the conspirators, added a layer of internal political crisis to the external pressure. Members of the royal harem, apparently in league with officials and military officers, plotted to kill the pharaoh and place a different prince on the throne. Whether the plot succeeded in killing Ramesses, or whether he died of other causes shortly after its discovery, remains debated. What is not debated is that the conspiracy existed, was tried, and resulted in the execution or forced suicide of multiple senior officials. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses III, a sequence of rulers all named Ramesses, the 4th through the 11th, spanning roughly a century, presided over a progressive diminishment that the historical record tracks with uncomfortable clarity. The inscriptions become fewer. The building projects become smaller. The foreign correspondence, once a constant stream of diplomatic exchange with the great powers of the region, dwindles and then effectively stops, because the great powers of the region no longer exist. Egypt in the 11th century BCE was not corresponding with the Hittites because there were no more Hittites. It was not negotiating with Ugarit because Ugarit was a ruin. The network of relationships that had structured Egyptian foreign policy for 2 centuries had been replaced by a silence that the Egyptian administrative apparatus had no established procedures for addressing. The Third Intermediate Period, which began around 1070 BCE with the end of the New Kingdom, saw Egypt fragment in ways that recalled the First Intermediate Period of 1,000 years earlier. Political division between North and South, competing dynasties, the power of the priesthood of Amun at Karnak growing to the point where the high priest effectively ruled Upper Egypt as an independent authority, while pharaohs nominally claimed sovereignty from the Delta. And yet Egypt remained. The temples were maintained. The religious calendar was observed. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, the proper functioning of the world, continued to structure Egyptian thought and Egyptian institutional life, even as the institutions themselves contracted and fragmented. The Egyptians had survived collapse before. They had a cultural memory of reconstitution, of finding the thread of continuity through the chaos and pulling it forward into a new configuration. What they could not reconstitute was the world that had surrounded them. The Bronze Age international system, the network of trade and diplomacy and mutual dependency that had made the new kingdom possible, was gone. Egypt could rebuild its internal coherence, and eventually it did. What it could not rebuild was the context in which it had been a great power among great powers, corresponding with equals, projecting authority across a Levantine empire, participating in a Mediterranean world that no longer existed. The pyramids still stood, the temples still stood, the Nile still flooded, approximately as it always had, depositing the silt that made the valley floor fertile and the civilization that depended on it possible. But the scribes who recorded the flood levels each year were recording them for an Egypt that was smaller than it had been, quieter, more turned inward. An Egypt that had survived by becoming, in certain essential ways, less than it had been. Surviving and continuing are not the same thing. Egypt knew this. It had always known this. It had written the knowledge into its theology, into its art, into the very structure of its funerary beliefs. The understanding that what endures does so only through constant effort, constant maintenance, constant renewal. The effort continued. The renewal came eventually in new forms. But the world that had made the new kingdom possible did not come back. That world was gone, and nothing that followed it would be quite the same thing again. The writing stopped. That is the fact that is hardest to absorb. Not the burning of the palaces. Palaces had burned before and been rebuilt. Not the disruption of trade. Trade routes had been disrupted before and reopened. Not even the collapse of the political order. Political orders had collapsed before in the Aegean and been reconstituted under different arrangements. What had not happened before, in the entire recorded history of the region, was the disappearance of writing itself. Linear B, the syllabic script used by the Mycenaean palace administrators to record their inventories, their personnel lists, their religious offerings, their land tenure arrangements, vanished from the archaeological record around 1200 BCE and did not reappear for approximately 400 years. 400 years of silence. Not metaphorical silence, literal silence. The absence of written records from a region that had been producing them continuously for centuries. The Greece that emerged from the other side of that silence, the Greece of Homer, of the city-states, of the alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians and adapted to record a language that had been spoken continuously through the gap, had no memory of what had come before. The Mycenaean world was not a dimly remembered ancestor. It was completely forgotten, preserved only in the distorted reflections of myth. The Mycenaean civilization had been, at its height, one of the most sophisticated palace economies in the Bronze Age world. The great citadels, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, or Orchomenos, were not cities in the Mediterranean sense, but fortified administrative centers, each controlling a surrounding territory from which agricultural surplus was extracted, processed, and redistributed through the palace mechanism. The walls of Mycenae and Tiryns were constructed from stone so massive that later Greeks, encountering them and unable to explain how human hands had moved such blocks, attributed their construction to the cyclopes. Cyclopean masonry, the term still used in archaeology, preserves that attribution, the memory of a bewilderment that is itself a measure of the distance between the Mycenaean world and the world that came after. The Linear B tablets, deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952 in one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, revealed that the Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek. This was not expected. The assumption before decipherment had been that Linear B recorded a non-Greek language, and the discovery that the palace administrators of Bronze Age Greece were writing in Greek pushed the documented history of the Greek language back by several centuries. It also revealed the texture of Mycenaean palace life with the same administrative intimacy that the cuneiform archives had revealed for Mesopotamia. The tablets from Pylos are the most extensive single archive. They record, in the weeks or months before the palace was destroyed, around 1180 BCE, a society mobilizing for a threat it clearly anticipated but could not prevent. Rowers being assigned to ships, watchers being posted on the coast, bronze being collected from sanctuaries and redistributed as weapons, a detail that implies the normal supply chains for bronze had already been disrupted, and the palace was stripping its ritual objects to arm its soldiers. The palace at Pylos burned. Unlike the citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns, Pylos had no defensive walls, an absence that reads, in retrospect, as the same confidence that had left Knossos unwalled, and that ended the same way. The fire that destroyed Pylos was intense enough to bake the Linear B tablets in place, preserving them the way the fire at Ugarit had preserved the tablets in that kiln. Catastrophe as archivist, destruction as the condition of survival. Mycenae and Tiryns survived the initial crisis. Their walls were not breached, or not immediately. But survival in the 12th century BCE, Aegean, was a diminishing proposition. The trade networks that had supplied the palaces with the raw materials they needed to function, the copper and tin for bronze, the luxury goods that marked palatial authority, the grain imports that supplemented domestic production during poor harvests, were gone. A palace economy without external supply chains is not a palace economy. It is a large building with administrative pretensions and a shrinking resource base. The depopulation of the Greek mainland in the period between 1200 and 1000 BCE is visible in the archaeological record with painful clarity. Settlement sites that show continuous occupation through the Mycenaean period are abandoned. The population of Greece may have declined by as much as 75% over the course of 2 centuries, a figure that, if accurate, represents one of the most severe demographic catastrophes in European prehistory. People did not simply stop building palaces. They stopped existing in the numbers that had made the palaces possible. Where did they go? Some migrated to Cyprus, where the archaeological record shows a significant influx of Aegean-style material culture in the 12th century, suggesting that refugees from the Mycenaean collapse brought their pottery traditions and their architectural practices with them to an island that was absorbing displaced populations from multiple directions simultaneously. Some moved to the coast of Anatolia, establishing communities that would eventually become the Ionian Greek cities of the historical period. Some simply dispersed into smaller, less visible settlements in the Greek countryside, living in ways that left fewer traces in the archaeological record. And some stayed. In the ruins of the citadels, in the shadow of the Cyclopean walls, small communities continued to exist through the Greek Dark Ages, the period between roughly 1100 and 800 BCE, during which the material complexity of Mycenaean civilization was replaced by something simpler, more local, less connected to the wider Mediterranean world. Iron began to replace bronze, not because anyone had decided to change technologies, but because the supply chains for bronze no longer functioned and iron ore was available locally. Pottery styles simplified. Long-distance trade contracted to a fraction of its Bronze Age volume. The stories survived, not written down, There was no writing to write them down in, but spoken, repeated, accumulated across the generations of the Dark Ages into something that, by the time writing returned to Greece in the 8th century BCE, had become the epic tradition that Homer inherited and shaped into the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Trojan War, whatever historical event or events may lie behind it, is set in the last generation of the Mycenaean world. The heroes who fight at Troy are, in the Homeric telling, the last men of a heroic age, larger, stronger, closer to the gods than the diminished humans of the poet's own time. The Nostos, the return home, that structures the Odyssey, is not just Odysseus returning to Ithaca. It is the Mycenaean world, trying to return to itself and finding that the home it left no longer exists. Homer did not know about Linear B. He did not know about the palace at Pylos, or the tablets that recorded the mobilization of its rowers in the weeks before its destruction. He did not know that the world his heroes inhabited had been a real world, with administrative records and bronze inventories and watchers posted on the coast. He knew the stories. He knew that something had ended. He knew that the men who came before had done things that the men of his own time could no longer do, and that the reasons for this were obscure, and that the distance between then and now was not merely time, but a kind of rupture, a break in continuity so complete that the before and after felt like different worlds. He was right. They were. The writing had stopped. The palaces had burned. The trade routes had closed. The population had collapsed. And in the silence that followed, across 400 years of unrecorded life, the Greeks forgot everything except the stories, which turned out to be enough. The Hittite Empire did not fall, it dissolved. The distinction matters. A fall implies a moment, a battle lost, a capital taken, a dynasty ended by the sword of a successor. The Hittite Empire had no such moment, or rather, it had several, none of them definitive, spread across decades of progressive contraction that left behind not a clear ending, but an absence. The correspondence stopped. The administrative records stopped. The great seal of the Hittite king, pressed into clay on documents that had coordinated the affairs of an empire stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates, was pressed for the last time sometime around 1180 BCE, and then not again. Hattusa, the capital, was abandoned. The excavation of the site shows a city that was not destroyed in the conventional sense, not burned comprehensively, not looted systematically, not subjected to the kind of violence that leaves a clear archaeological signature. It was left. The population departed, taking what they could carry, leaving behind the massive stone walls, the great temple, the administrative buildings that had housed the archive. The buildings were burned, but selectively, possibly by the departing inhabitants themselves, a ritual destruction of what could not be taken, or possibly by the groups who moved through the area in the wake of the departure. What those groups were is not entirely clear. The Kaska peoples from the north, who had raided the Hittite heartland for generations, moved into the vacuum left by the empire's withdrawal. Other groups, unnamed in the surviving records because the surviving records had stopped being produced, moved through Anatolia in patterns that the archaeological evidence traces through pottery styles and settlement distributions rather than through texts. The Neo-Hittite states that emerged in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria in the centuries after the collapse were not continuations of the empire. They were fragments, city-states that preserved elements of Hittite culture, that used a form of Luwian hieroglyphic writing descended from the Hittite tradition, that maintained the worship of Hittite deities and followed Hittite artistic conventions. But they did not control Anatolia. They did not correspond with Egypt as equals. They did not maintain the diplomatic relationships that had made the Hittite Empire a great power. They were in the precise sense remnants, the pieces that remained after the whole had ceased to exist. The Luwian-speaking populations of western Anatolia, the region the Greeks would call Lydia, Caria, Lytia, experienced the collapse differently than the Hittite heartland. They were peripheral to the empire's administrative core, connected to it through tribute relationships and military obligations, but not dependent on it in the same total way that the palace economies of the Aegean had been dependent on the Bronze Age trade network. When the empire contracted, they contracted with it, but were not eliminated by it. They persisted, adapted, continued in simpler forms. Cyprus, which had been one of the most important nodes in the Bronze Age trade network, the primary source of copper for the entire eastern Mediterranean, a cosmopolitan island where Mycenaean Greeks, Levantines, Egyptians, and Anatolians had all maintained communities, underwent a transformation that the archaeological record tracks with unusual clarity. The destruction levels at the major Cypriot cities, Enkomi, Kition, Paliaphos, date to approximately 1200 BCE. Some sites were abandoned. Others were rebuilt, often by populations whose material culture shows Aegean origins. The refugees from the Mycenaean collapse, arriving on an island that was itself in the process of reconstituting itself after its own disruptions. The result was a Cyprus that was, by the 11th century BCE, more Greek in its cultural orientation than it had been before. Not because anyone had planned this outcome, but because the collapse had redistributed populations in ways that left Aegean-speaking communities dominant on an island that had previously been more culturally diverse. The Cypriot syllabary, a writing system descended from the Cypro-Minoan script of the Bronze Age, continued to be used for writing Greek on Cyprus until the 4th century BCE, long after the mainland Greeks had adopted the Phoenician-derived alphabet. A Bronze Age writing tradition, surviving, on one island, into the classical period. The Assyrians, whose empire lay to the east of the collapse's epicenter, survived with less disruption than their western neighbors. Assyria had been a significant power in the Middle Bronze Age, had contracted during the period of Mitanni dominance, and had re-emerged as a major force in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. The collapse of the Hittite Empire removed Assyria's most significant rival to the north and west. The disruption of the Levantine trade networks hurt Assyrian commerce, but did not eliminate Assyrian institutional continuity in the way that the palace economies of the Aegean had been eliminated. The Neo-Assyrian Empire that emerged in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, the empire that would eventually dominate the entire Near East, that would destroy the Kingdom of Israel and threaten Egypt and reach a scale of territorial control that the Bronze Age great powers had never achieved, grew from a core that had survived the collapse precisely because it was sufficiently inland, sufficiently self-contained, sufficiently organized around military rather than commercial power to maintain its institutional coherence, when the network that had connected it to the wider world broke down. Anatolia, in the 2 centuries after the Hittite collapse, was a landscape of fragments, small kingdoms where there had been an empire, local cultures where there had been an international administrative system, villages where there had been palace complexes. The material culture of the period, the pottery, the metalwork, the architecture, shows a consistent pattern of simplification, not incompetence, not savagery, simplification. A reduction in complexity that matches the reduction in the systems that had sustained complexity. The iron that the Hittites had been developing, the technology that the last Hittite king had sent as the diplomatic gesture to Egypt in the form of a single dagger, spread through Anatolia and the wider Mediterranean in the centuries after the collapse. Not because anyone had decided to transition from bronze to iron, but because the supply chains for bronze had broken down, and iron ore was locally available in ways that copper and tin were not. The Iron Age did not begin as a technological revolution. It began as an improvisation, as the response of craftsmen who no longer had access to the materials their predecessors had used, working with what they could find. The Hittite archive at Hattusa, tens of thousands of tablets, the most complete record of any Bronze Age great power, sat in the ruins of the administrative buildings, buried under the collapse of the structures that had housed them for 3,000 years. When archaeologists began excavating the site in the early 20th century, they found the tablets in the debris layers, mixed with the rubble of the walls and roofs that had fallen on them. The tablets recorded everything: treaties and myths and horse training manuals and diplomatic correspondence and religious rituals, and the administrative details of an empire that had, at its height, coordinated the affairs of hundreds of thousands of people across a vast territory. They recorded it in a language that no one had spoken for 3,000 years, in a script that no one had read for 3,000 years, preserved in the ruins of a city that had been forgotten so completely that its location was uncertain until the excavations began. The knowledge was there. It had always been there, under the ground, waiting. The civilization that had produced it was not. It was not darkness. That is the first correction that needs to be made. The Greek Dark Ages, the period between approximately 1100 and 800 BCE, that separates the Mycenaean world from the world of the city-states and the alphabet and the Olympic Games, were not dark in the sense of barbaric or violent or intellectually empty. They were dark in the sense that we cannot see them clearly. The absence of writing means the absence of the kind of evidence that historians depend on most heavily. What remains is archaeology, pottery sequences, settlement patterns, burial practices, metal objects, the physical traces of lives lived without the administrative apparatus that generates written records. And what archaeology shows is not darkness. It shows simplification, contraction, a reduction in the scale and complexity of human organization that was, for the people living through it, probably experienced not as catastrophe, but as the normal conditions of life, because the catastrophe had happened a generation or two earlier, and what remained was simply what remained. The population of Greece at the height of the Mycenaean period has been estimated, with the uncertainty appropriate to estimates based on archaeological survey rather than census records, at somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 people. By 1000 BCE, the same methods suggest a population of perhaps 100,000, a reduction of 80% or more spread across 2 centuries, visible in the shrinking of settlement sites and the disappearance of entire categories of material culture that require specialized production and exchange networks to sustain. Pottery is the archaeologist's primary tool for tracking these changes, because pottery is nearly indestructible and nearly ubiquitous. Mycenaean pottery, the fine ware produced in palace workshops, decorated with marine motifs and geometric patterns, exported across the Mediterranean in quantities that make it one of the most widely distributed artifact types of the Bronze Age, disappears from the record after approximately 1100 BCE. What replaces it in the early Dark Ages is simpler, less varied, made locally rather than in specialized workshops, decorated with patterns that show the influence of the Mycenaean tradition but lack its technical sophistication. This is not a people forgetting how to make pottery. It is a people making pottery without the infrastructure that had previously sustained high-quality production, without the palace workshops, without the trade networks that had distributed fine ware across the Mediterranean, without the specialized craftsmen whose skills had been maintained by institutional support. What they made was adequate for what they needed. It was not what their predecessors had made. The same pattern appears in metalwork. Bronze objects become rarer in the early Dark Ages, not because the technology was lost, but because the supply chains for copper and tin had broken down. Iron objects become more common, made from ore that could be found and smelted locally, by craftsmen who were learning a new technology through practice rather than inheriting it through institutional training. Early Iron Age ironwork is technically inferior to late Bronze Age bronzework. It improves over generations as the craftsmen develop their understanding of the new material. By 900 BCE, Greek ironwork is accomplished. By 700 BCE, it is sophisticated. The transition from bronze to iron is often described as a technological revolution, the discovery of a superior material that displaced an inferior one. The actual transition was messier and more contingent than that description implies. Iron is not straightforwardly superior to bronze. In its unworked state, iron ore is more widely available than copper and tin. But working iron into useful objects requires higher temperatures and more complex techniques than working bronze. Steel, iron with a controlled carbon content, significantly harder and more versatile than either pure iron or bronze, was not produced reliably until well into the Iron Age. The craftsmen of the early Dark Ages were not upgrading to a better technology. They were substituting an available material for an unavailable one, and learning, over generations, how to make the substitution work. What was lost in the collapse and not recovered during the Dark Ages is a question that archaeologists and historians approach with care, because the answer is partly unknowable. Writing was lost in the Greek world, and with it, the administrative capacity to coordinate large-scale activities, the ability to transmit technical knowledge in permanent form, the possibility of the kind of historical consciousness that requires records to sustain itself. Long-distance trade contracted dramatically. The Mediterranean, that had been, in the late Bronze Age, a road traveled by ships carrying goods from 7 cultures, contracted to a series of local exchanges with occasional longer connections. The palace economies, the redistributive systems that had taken agricultural surplus and converted it into specialized production, that had maintained craftsmen and soldiers and administrators and priests as full-time specialists, supported by the labor of the farming population, disappeared and were not replaced for centuries. The social complexity they had sustained disappeared with them. The Dark Ages were, in significant part, an age of chiefs rather than kings, of local strongmen controlling small territories through personal authority and military capacity, rather than through the bureaucratic machinery of a palace state. And yet, the language survived. Greek was spoken continuously through the Dark Ages. There is no break in the linguistic record, no moment of discontinuity between Mycenaean Greek and the Greek of the historical period. The stories survived, carried in memory, and repeated in performance across the generations that had no writing to record them. The religious traditions survived. The gods of the Mycenaean world are recognizable in the gods of classical Greece, transformed and reinterpreted but continuous. The fundamental practices of agriculture survived, the cultivation of wheat and barley, the tending of olive trees and vineyards, the rhythms of the agricultural year that had structured life in the Aegean for millennia before the Bronze Age, and would continue to structure it for millennia after. What survived was what could survive without institutions, language, story, memory. The knowledge embedded in practice rather than in administrative records. How to grow grain, how to tend animals, how to build a boat adequate for coastal fishing, how to work metal well enough to make tools. The knowledge that lived in people rather than in systems. The Phoenicians, meanwhile, were doing something that would change the world more profoundly than anything the Bronze Age palace economies had achieved. Along the Levantine coast, in Tyre, in Sidon, in Byblos, in the other city-states that had survived the collapse in reduced but functional form, the successors of the Bronze Age trading culture were adapting. They had lost their palace economies. They had lost their connections to the great powers that had organized the Bronze Age network. What they retained was their maritime knowledge, their commercial relationships, and the alphabetic writing system that Ugarit had developed, and that the Phoenicians simplified and extended. The Phoenician alphabet, 22 consonantal signs, learnable in weeks rather than years, requiring no institutional training to master, spread through the Mediterranean in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, with a speed that the cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems had never achieved. The Greeks adopted it and added vowels. The Romans adopted the Greek version and adapted it further. The alphabet in which this narrative exists is a direct descendant of the system developed on the Levantine coast in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, by people who had lost almost everything and were building from what remained. The Dark Ages were not an interruption in human history. They were a reorganization, painful, costly in population and complexity and accumulated knowledge, but not terminal. The world that emerged from them was different from the world that had entered them, smaller in some ways, less connected, less administratively complex, but not finished. The absence of records is not the absence of life. It is only the absence of the kind of evidence that allows us to see life clearly from a distance of 3,000 years. The people of the Dark Ages lived. They spoke their language and told their stories and tended their fields and buried their dead, and looked at the massive stones of the Mycenaean walls and wondered, as people have always wondered when confronted with the evidence of what came before, how it had been done. They did not know. The knowledge had gone with the system that produced it. But they were still here, and that, in the end, was the thing that mattered most. The archaeologist's first question is always the same. Where are the bodies? A city destroyed by conquest produces bodies. They appear in the destruction layer, in the streets, in the buildings, in positions that speak to the manner of death and the speed of the event. A city taken by siege produces bodies at the walls, in the final defensive positions, in the places where the last resistance was concentrated. A city burned by an invading army produces bodies mixed with the ash and the collapsed roofing material, the physical evidence of violence committed against a population that did not escape. The destruction layers of the late Bronze Age collapse do not consistently produce bodies. At site after site across the eastern Mediterranean, Mycenae, Tiryns, Ugarit, the Cypriot palace cities, the Levantine trading ports, the archaeology of the collapse period shows burned buildings, abandoned objects, the material signatures of sudden departure. What it does not consistently show is the mass casualties that conquest and massacre produce. The people, in most cases, are gone, not dead in place, gone. This is one of the most puzzling features of the collapse, and one of the most revealing. A destruction without bodies is a destruction that the population survived, at least long enough to leave. The burning of Mycenaean palaces, which the archaeological record documents clearly, was not accompanied by the slaughter of their inhabitants. The inhabitants had already gone, or went during the burning, or burned the buildings themselves as they left. The destruction was real. The violence may have been real, but the outcome was not massacre. It was dispersal. The absence of systematic looting at many collapse period sites is equally puzzling and equally revealing. A city taken by an enemy army is looted, its portable valuables removed, its stores emptied, its bronze objects melted down for reuse. The Bronze Age collapse sites show selective abandonment rather than systematic looting. Valuable objects left in place. Hoards hidden but never recovered, which means the people who hid them did not return, but also that no one else found them, which implies that the sites were not occupied by populations with the time and organization to conduct systematic searches. The Uluburun shipwreck tells a version of the same story from a different angle. A ship goes down with its cargo intact. 20 tons of copper ingots, tin, glass, ebony, ivory, the accumulated trade goods of the late Bronze Age world. No one recovers the cargo. In a functioning Bronze Age economy, a shipwreck of that value would have attracted salvage attempts. The location was known to the crew of any ships in the area at the time of sinking, and the cargo was worth enough to motivate significant effort to recover it. The cargo was not recovered, which implies that the network capable of organizing salvage operations had ceased to function before anyone could act. The archaeologist Robert Drews, in his influential study of the collapse, argued that the destruction pattern at Mycenaean sites points specifically to a new style of infantry warfare, soldiers fighting on foot rather than from chariots, using slashing weapons rather than thrusting ones, capable of overrunning palace defenses that had been designed to face chariot-based armies. His argument has been contested and refined by subsequent scholarship, but the underlying observation remains valid. The destruction pattern is distinctive, and it requires explanation. Brandon Drake's analysis of pollen cores and isotope records added the climate dimension. Evidence of drought beginning around 1200 BCE and continuing for several decades, affecting agricultural yields across the eastern Mediterranean in ways that the palace economies, with their reduced surplus buffers, could not absorb. Eric Klein's synthesis of the evidence for his book 1177 BC, the year he identifies as the approximate moment of peak crisis, argues for a perfect storm of simultaneous stressors, no single one of which would have been fatal to the system, but whose combination exceeded the system's capacity to respond. The archaeology of the collapse period also reveals something about the texture of the crisis that the textual evidence alone does not capture. The linear B tablets from Pylos, recording the mobilization of rowers and the redistribution of bronze in the weeks before the palace's destruction, suggest a society that was aware of the threat and attempting to respond. But the response was inadequate, not because the palace administrators were incompetent, but because the threat exceeded what the administrative system had been designed to handle. The Pylos archive contains a tablet that lists women and children from specific locations, women designated as workers, assigned to the palace's textile production facilities. Some of these women are identified by ethnic designations that suggest origins outside the Mycenaean heartland: Cnidian women, Milesian women, Asiatic women. The palace economy was drawing labor from a wide geographic area, sustaining its specialized production through a workforce that included people who had come from or been brought from considerable distances. Those women disappear from the record with the archive. Where they went, whether they fled with the palace population, whether they were captured by whoever destroyed the palace, whether they dispersed into the surrounding countryside and lived out their lives in the simpler conditions of the post-collapse period, the archaeology cannot say. They were there, recorded in the administrative system with the same meticulous attention to category and quantity that the system applied to everything else. and then they were not. The hoards tell their own story. Bronze Age hoards, collections of valuable objects buried for safekeeping and never recovered, increased dramatically in frequency during the collapse period. From Greece to the Levant, from Anatolia to Egypt, people were burying their valuables in expectation of return. The return did not happen. The objects remained in the ground for 3,000 years, until modern archaeology found them. Bronze weapons, gold jewelry, ingots of copper and tin, the portable wealth of a world that was trying to preserve itself against a crisis it could feel but not fully see. Each unretrieved hoard is a small tragedy with a specific human weight. Someone made a decision to bury rather than carry, to hide rather than flee with the object in hand, to trust that they would return and that the place they were leaving would still be there when they did. The decision was wrong. The place was not there. The person did not return, or returned to find conditions so altered that the location of the hoard could no longer be identified, or did not return at all. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse is not, ultimately, a mystery about causes. The causes are well enough understood: drought, systems failure, migration, the cascading breakdown of a network that had grown too complex and too interdependent to survive simultaneous stresses. The mystery is about experience, about what it felt like to be inside the collapse, to be one of the people burying their bronze and their gold in expectation of a return that never came. The archaeology gives us objects. It gives us burn layers and abandoned sites and unretrieved hoards and the bones of animals, but rarely of people. It gives us, in the unfired tablets from Ugarit and the mobilization records from Pylos, the last administrative acts of systems that were trying to manage what could not be managed. What it does not give us, what it cannot give us, is the moment of understanding, the moment when someone realized that they were not going to return, that the crisis was not a crisis, but an ending, that the world they had known was not going to reconstitute itself on the other side of whatever was happening. The mystery is not what was destroyed. The mystery is what it was like to watch it go. The bodies are not in the ruins. They went somewhere else. They carried what they could and left what they could not, and moved into a future that neither they nor we can fully see. The objects remained, patient, inert, indifferent to the question of what had happened to the hands that made them, waiting, as objects always wait, for someone to find them and ask. No single theory is sufficient. That is the conclusion that decades of scholarship have produced, and it is a conclusion that feels at first like a failure, like the admission that the question cannot be answered. It is not a failure. It is the most accurate thing that can be said about an event of this complexity, and the discomfort it produces is the discomfort of a question that does not resolve into a clean answer. The Bronze Age collapse happened. It was real. Its consequences were catastrophic and measurable and visible in the archaeological record across an entire region. And it happened because of several things simultaneously, in ways that the simultaneous occurrence made catastrophic in ways that any single factor alone would not have been. The climate theory is the one that has gained the most traction in recent scholarship, partly because of the quality of the paleoclimate evidence, and partly because it offers a cause that is genuinely systemic, something that affected the entire Eastern Mediterranean at once, rather than originating in one place and spreading. The pollen cause, the isotope records, the tree ring data, all of it points toward a prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BCE, reducing agricultural yields across the region for several decades. Brandon Drake's 2012 analysis of marine sediment cores from the Sea of Marmara showed a significant aridification event coinciding precisely with the collapse period. A study published in 2013 using stable isotope analysis of grain from archaeological sites in the Levant showed a shift toward more drought-resistant crops in the years before the destruction layers, farmers adapting in real time to conditions that were becoming less reliable. But drought alone does not explain the destruction of the palace systems. Droughts had occurred before in the Bronze Age world, and the palace economies had survived them, had in fact been partly designed to buffer against them, their grain storage systems providing reserves precisely for the years when the harvest came up short. What made the drought of 1200 BCE different was not its severity alone, but its timing, arriving when the system's buffers had been reduced, when the trade networks that might have compensated for regional shortfalls were already under stress, when the political relationships that sustained the mutual assistance mechanisms of the great powers were already strained. The Sea Peoples theory, the argument that migrating populations from the Aegean and Anatolia drove the collapse through military pressure, was the dominant explanation for most of the 20th century, and it has not been entirely abandoned. The Egyptian records are explicit about the threat they posed, and the destruction layers at Levantine sites are real. But the Sea Peoples theory, in its strong form, requires the migrating populations to have been both numerous enough and organized enough to simultaneously destroy the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean palace system, the Ugaritic trading network, and the Levantine city-states, while also being repelled by Egypt. The logistics of that scenario are difficult to sustain. The Sea Peoples were a significant factor. They were not the cause. Robert Drew's infantry revolution theory, the argument that new fighting techniques rendered chariot-based armies obsolete and destroyed the military advantage that the palace economies had relied on, is elegant and has attracted serious attention. The evidence for a shift in military technology during the collapse period is real. The problem is that military innovation alone does not explain the abandonment of cities, the disappearance of writing, the collapse of trade networks. It might explain military defeats. It does not explain the full scope of what happened. The systems collapse theory, associated most prominently with Eric Klein, whose synthesis of the evidence remains the most accessible account of the collapse for a general audience, argues that the Bronze Age world was a complex system operating near the limits of its resilience, and that the simultaneous occurrence of multiple stressors pushed it past the threshold from which recovery was possible. Drought reduced agricultural surplus. Reduced surplus stressed the trade networks. Stressed trade networks disrupted the supply of raw materials. Disrupted raw material supply undermined the palace economies. Undermined palace economies lost their capacity to maintain military forces and administrative systems. The loss of administrative capacity accelerated the breakdown of the trade networks. Each failure created conditions for further failures. This is not a theory that identifies a single cause. It is a theory about how causes interact, about how a system that has been optimized for efficiency rather than resilience responds to stress. It is, in that sense, a theory that speaks directly to the present, in ways that the scholars who developed it have not always made explicit, but that their readers have consistently noticed. The internal rebellions theory notes that the collapse period coincides with evidence for social disruption within the palace economies themselves. The strike at Deir el-Medina, the conspiracy against Ramesses III, the possible evidence for peasant revolts at some Mycenaean sites. Palace economies were redistributive systems that depended on the compliance of the populations they extracted surplus from. If that compliance broke down, if the populations that had sustained the palaces decided, under the pressure of drought and reduced rations and unreliable grain distributions, that the system was no longer worth sustaining, The palaces could collapse from within as easily as from without. The earthquake theory was more prominent in earlier scholarship than it is now. Earthquakes did occur in the eastern Mediterranean during the collapse period. There is geological evidence for seismic activity at several sites. But earthquakes, even significant ones, do not produce the kind of systemic, region-wide collapse that the evidence describes. They destroy buildings. They do not destroy trade networks or writing systems or the political will to rebuild. What the accumulation of theories reveals taken together is a collapse that was overdetermined, caused by more things than were necessary to cause it, driven by stressors that were individually manageable but collectively fatal. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It does not produce the clean narrative of a cause and an effect, a villain and a victim, an explanation that resolves the mystery into something containable. It produces instead a picture of a world that had built itself to a level of complexity that exceeded its capacity for resilience, that had created, in the late Bronze Age international system, something genuinely extraordinary, genuinely unprecedented, genuinely worth the word civilization in its fullest sense, and had built it without understanding how fragile extraordinary things can be. The scholars who study the collapse are, almost without exception, people who find it personally disturbing. Not because they romanticize the Bronze Age. The palace economies were extractive, hierarchical, often brutal in their treatment of the populations they administered, but because the collapse demonstrates something about complex systems that is difficult to look at directly. That complexity and fragility are not opposites. That the most sophisticated, most interconnected, most productive systems human beings have ever built are also, precisely because of those qualities, the most vulnerable to cascading failure. No single theory is sufficient. All of them are true. The drought was real. The migrations were real. The military pressure was real. The internal stresses were real. The system's failure was real. They happened together, in a world that had no capacity to absorb simultaneous shocks of that magnitude, and the result was a collapse so complete that the people who lived through it could not explain it, and the people who came after them forgot it had happened. The most unsettling aspect of the Bronze Age collapse is not its causes, it is its speed. A system that had been building for 2,000 years, that had produced the pyramids and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the palace at Knossos, and the treaty between Ramesses and the Hittites and the trading network of Ugarit, collapsed within a human lifetime, within living memory. The people who were born into the late Bronze Age world and lived to see its end, saw it end while they were still alive. They did not know what to call what they were seeing. They did not have a framework for it. They wrote their letters and sent their grain requests and posted their watches on the coast and buried their bronze in the ground and waited for a normalcy that was not going to return. The theories explain what happened. They do not explain what it was like to be there when it happened. That knowledge went with the people who had it, into the silence, into the 400 years of unwritten life that followed, into the ground with the hordes waiting to be found. The Iron Age did not begin with a discovery. It began with a necessity. Somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, in the decades after the collapse, a craftsman who had previously worked in bronze found himself without the materials to continue. The copper routes were closed. The tin was not arriving. The palace that had supplied him with raw materials and a market for his finished goods no longer existed. What he had was iron ore, locally available, previously considered inferior, previously used only when bronze was unavailable or too expensive for the purpose at hand. He worked with what he had. He learnt, through practice, how to make it adequate. His students learnt to make it better. their students learn to make it good. This is how most technological transitions actually happen. Not through the recognition of a superior technology and the deliberate decision to adopt it, but through the removal of the alternative. The Iron Age was not chosen. It was what remained when the Bronze Age ended. The craftsmen who built it were not visionaries. They were survivors, working with available materials, passing knowledge forward in the only way knowledge had ever been passed forward, person to person, practice to practice, generation to generation. By 900 BCE, iron tools and weapons were common across the Mediterranean and the Near East. By 800 BCE, the technology had improved to the point where iron was genuinely superior to bronze for most practical purposes: harder, more widely available, cheaper to produce in quantity. The Bronze Age had ended, not because iron was better, but because the system that made bronze possible had collapsed. Iron became better, in the hands of the craftsmen who had no alternative, because necessity is a more demanding teacher than abundance. The world that emerged from the collapse was, in almost every measurable dimension, smaller than the world that had preceded it, less populous, less connected, less administratively complex, less capable of the kind of coordinated large-scale activity that had built the pyramids and the palace at Knossos and the trade network of Ugarit. The cities that grew in the early Iron Age were not the palace cities of the Bronze Age. They were something different, organized around different principles, sustained by different mechanisms, producing different kinds of culture. The Phoenician city-states of the Levant, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Carthage, were the most direct institutional successors of the Bronze Age trading culture. They had survived the collapse in reduced form and rebuilt their maritime commerce on a smaller but more resilient model. Where the Bronze Age trade network had been organized through palace-to-palace relationships, sustained by diplomatic agreements between great powers and administered by palace bureaucracies, the Phoenician trade was organized through merchant networks, decentralized, flexible, capable of rerouting around disruptions in ways that the palace economies had never been. The Phoenicians colonized the western Mediterranean, Carthage, Cadiz, Palermo, extending the reach of eastern Mediterranean commerce further west than the Bronze Age network had ever reached. The Greeks, emerging from the Dark Ages in the 8th century BCE, invented something that the Bronze Age world had not produced: the polis, the city-state organized around citizenship rather than palace administration. The democratic experiments of Athens, the military culture of Sparta, the philosophical traditions that would shape Western thought for 2.5 millennia, all of it grew from a society that had lost the palace economies and built something different in their place. Something that, in certain respects, proved more durable, more generative, more capable of producing the kind of cultural innovation that survives its own political context. Whether the collapse made this possible, whether the destruction of the Bronze Age palace systems was, in some sense, a necessary precondition for the world that followed, is a question that historians approach with appropriate caution. History does not have counterfactuals. We cannot know what the world would have looked like if the Bronze Age had continued. What we can say is that the world that emerged from the collapse was genuinely different from the world that had preceded it, and that some of what it produced was extraordinary. The alphabet spread, the one that the Phoenicians had developed from the Ugaritic tradition, the one that the Greeks adopted and modified, the one that the Romans took from the Greeks and carried across Europe. That alphabet is the most consequential technology of the post-collapse world, more consequential than iron, more consequential than the trireme or the catapult, or any of the military technologies of the classical period, writing that anyone could learn in weeks rather than years without institutional training, writing that did not require a palace to sustain it, writing that could be used by merchants and farmers and philosophers and poets without the administrative apparatus of a redistributive economy to support them. The Bronze Age had writing. The palace scribes of Mycenae and Ugarit and Hattusa were sophisticated administrators who produced records of extraordinary detail and variety. But their writing was institutional. It required the palace to train the scribes, to supply the materials, to provide the context in which writing was useful. When the palaces fell, the writing fell with them. The alphabet survived the collapse because it did not require an institution to sustain it. It required only people, and people were what the post-collapse world still had. The Bronze Age is not a cautionary tale. That framing, the idea that the collapse teaches us something we should apply to our own situation, that the interdependence and complexity of the late Bronze Age world mirrors our own in ways we should find alarming, is a temptation that the scholars who study the collapse have not always resisted, and that this narrative has not entirely avoided. The parallels are real. A highly interconnected, highly optimized, highly interdependent global system, operating with reduced buffers, vulnerable to simultaneous stressors. The description fits both 1200 BCE and the present moment with uncomfortable precision. But the Bronze Age is also not merely a mirror. It is a world of craftsmen and scribes and merchants and kings and farmers and sailors and mothers writing to sons who had not written back. A world that built things of extraordinary beauty and complexity and then lost them. Not because the people in it were foolish or careless or less capable than we are, but because they were human, which is to say, capable of building systems more complex than any individual mind could fully comprehend, and therefore vulnerable to the failures that complexity, in the absence of resilience, always eventually produces. The last tablet from Ugarit was found in a kiln. The last records from Pylos were preserved by the fire that destroyed the palace around them. The Hittite archive at Hattusa lay under 3,000 years of rubble before anyone read it. The Bronze Age collapse was so complete that the civilizations that followed it had no memory that it had happened, that the world they were building on had once been something else entirely, something more elaborate and more connected and more fragile than anything they could imagine. We know. That is the extraordinary thing. We know because the tablets survived, because the archaeology persisted, because the scholars committed their working lives to recovering what had been lost. We know what the Bronze Age built and what ended it, and approximately how and approximately when. If this series has given you something, if the craftsman turning a bronze pin in his fingers in the first part, and the letter in the kiln in the 13th, and the unretrieved hoards in the 18th have added up to something that feels worth carrying, then this is the moment for the quietest possible gesture. A subscription costs nothing. It is the way of saying that this kind of work is worth continuing. The iron did not replace the bronze. It replaced the world that bronze had built, slowly, necessarily, in the hands of craftsmen who had no alternative, and made of that necessity something that lasted. The silence after the collapse was not empty. It was full of people living without records, passing knowledge forward in the only way available to them, building toward a world they could not see from where they stood. 3,000 years later, we can see it. We can see what they built and what they lost and what survived and what did not. We can read the last letter from Ugarit and understand what it was asking for and know that the answer never came. That knowledge is not comfortable. It was never meant to be. The Bronze Age ended. Something else began. It always does.